a great, aspect of the book that you can actually, like, I am not directly, in the field of critical theory or post-colonial thinking, but it really was a book I could read and sort of get very engaged with. So I want to begin by saying that, first of all. But also, I think that, what I'm going to do, and also, I want to say that it's a very interdisciplinary book. It takes from all sorts of strands of thought as well as of disciplines. So that also marks out, I think, one of the strengths of this book. And, just to sort of state it before I get into what I am going to focus on, that in this large book, there is also a fairly large chapter. Actually, I counted, it's 62 pages because I was struggling with how to abbreviate it and present it over here. And then finally, I thought, no, I'm going to say very few things because you have to really read it if you have to get into all the arguments, which is on psychoanalysis and the entry of psychoanalysis in the Global South. Yeah, and I must also emphasize that I found the methodology of the book very significant in the sense that the basic methodology is to, first of all, carve out the space called the Global South. So although the book is written from India and it is also a book which addresses India, it doesn't do it only from within, it actually does it seeing India as an aspect of the Global South, and then so you turn to theory also and writing and processes which are happening in other parts of the world, and also to look at the more marginalized, voices, discourses, etc. from within. So I thought this moving in towards the outside as well as, two outsides in a certain sense of the word that are being used, and I hope I'm, stating it correctly, but this is how I saw it. And I thought that was actually very interesting as a framework within which to place her arguments. So there is just one moment from the chapter on women which I want to, I don't need to sort of emphasize her feminist self, if I might use the word here, but there's just one moment in that book which I wanted to speak of because it reminded me of a work that one of our students at Ambedkar had done, which is a moment where she talks, which is from the chapter State, Religion and the Bodies of Women, where she points to women's agency despite the fact that their bodies are the site for the performance of both nationalism and community identity. Faith here is often a part of the picture, she says. And she talks about female circumcision, sati, and veiling. And there she talks about the fact that perhaps even though it's difficult to speak of agency in the context of circumcision or a sati, it is possible to discuss it in the context of veiling, and therefore there is a fairly complex discussion on veiling which follows in the book. But I wanted to say that in fact, interestingly, there's a work which a student of ours did at Ambedkar, her name is Naima Nasir, where she was actually looking at the Khatna tradition amongst Johri women. And she did her ethnography with them, talking to them, multiple voices there vis-a-vis the question of Khatna, from those who saw themselves as spokespersons of the community entitled to this right, to choose a certain kind, or sort of continue a certain kind of a tradition, to those who saw themselves as oppressed and victimized. But most interestingly, we found a mother of 2 daughters who actually had been through Khatna herself and did not want her daughters to have to go through it. And what she did was that she organized a party to celebrate Khatna without having actually got her daughters to go through the process. Right? And so you do find, interestingly, and I thought that was interesting also, because, here we see an example of a very relational self at play, the play of the mother, whose agency is actually sort of facilitating or protecting the daughters from a particular kind of a ritual, which is of course, located in faith at one level, but also faith in the context of all the problematics of being the minority of a minority type of a sort of identity which the Johri experience themselves to be located in. So I think questions of selfhood and questions of identity and questions of faith are really significant in this part of the world, and it's therefore very significant that Nivedita has chosen to write a chapter which looks at the entry of psychoanalysis in the global south. Now this is something that needn't have been done. I think the book would have worked without that also. So I'm also in a sense grateful for this interdisciplinary engagement, which I think is important, because it also opens out the question of how to think about the self in our part of the world. Now, what she has done, and I'm just going to very quickly try to not summarize, because there are too many strands, and too many locations that are being discussed here, so I'm not going to try to summarize it, but I will say that, we know that Freud was very skeptical of religion and, saw it basically as a necessary illusion to protect the infantile needs of the human. However, although I would also say that Freud was a very divided writer, and that's one of the points I want to come to later, as I'm just, saying what perhaps could be some of the problems in the way or some of the questions which, get opened out after reading the chapter that she's written. So, in fact, he's divided in the sense that he's a very scientific writer in bits. You also see in him a hermeneutic interpreter, and then you also see in him a very literary writer. So you see at least 3 strands in Freud. And also it has been said that even though he writes consciously against religion, in the future of an illusion, but he also, and in other texts for that matter, but there is also a kind of mysticism that you find in his writing. So there is some kind of, multiplicity of voices that we see in Freud, and that's just something which I thought I would like to foreground here. However, the worlds of India, China, Japan, Egypt, and others, where psychoanalysis entered, were spaces where secularization had not yet happened, nor was the family structure compatible with the Oedipal family, which is characteristic of the world where Freud wrote. So Nivedita points out that and as Nivedita points out, psychoanalysis entered these worlds where already well-articulated versions of the self existed, right? So these versions of the self were now, and there is a lot of detail here on what were these versions of the self, and it's really very informative and quite actually beautiful, if I might use that word, to read some of the accounts which we see coming from the Arabic world, the Buddhist world, and so on and so forth. But anyhow, so she says that there were many well-developed articulations, and these versions of the self were distinct from the modern notion of the bounded individual, which is tightly located within the body. Also, as she points out, in terms of Ramanujam's distinction between the self as context-sensitive and the self as context-free, there was a greater inclination towards contextual sensitivity. Perhaps it was for these reasons that there was considerable resistance to the reception of a secular version of psychoanalysis, and than that of other bodies of thought in the global south. This chapter provides a nuanced reading of the entry of psychoanalysis in the context of China and Japan, where debates take place between Buddhist, Confucian, and Taoist versions of the self, in India with aspects of Hindu, or as she has established very well, Brahmanical versions of selfhood, and in the Arabic culture where new understandings of the self were formulated by drawing upon psychoanalysis along with the writings of Islamic scholars like Ibn Arabi and Al-Sharafi. Now, in formulating these chapters, there are several moments where she illustrates the rich exchanges that may have contributed to the production of Western psychoanalysis. So I found that also interesting. That is, in seeing the, in actually trying to break down the binary between Eastern thought and Western thought. She's also talking about how thought from the global South has traveled to the European world, and how perhaps in Freud's work we also see some ideas which have, permeated from others. So you see, in Freud's work on memory and dreaming, we see the links with earlier writing of Arabic thinkers. And we also know that Freud, who was actually at that time struggling with the destruction of World War I, with the loss of his favorite grandchild, and with a clinical phenomenon which we call repetition, that is the tendency to repeat a non-pleasurable pattern, right? He found at that point of time the reference to nirvana, and that sort of worked itself into his thinking and in his writing of the important paper Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he also introduced the idea of the death drive. So there was definitely, I'm wondering here, and this is one of the questions I had, that was there already enough in psychoanalysis to make its entry in the non-West, if I may use that bad term right now, possible? I mean, this is just a thought that I was grappling with while I was reading, that what was it actually that made it possible for this different response to psychoanalysis from the responses that we have seen to other forms of thought. We also see that early psychoanalysts working in India, such as Viren Shekhar Bose, and Kosawa in Japan, articulate alternative versions of the Oedipus complex, of gender particularly, and they write to Freud about it. So there is a very early correspondence that is going on, but Freud is completely resistant by and large to the idea that these could be alternatives. In other words, from that right from the very beginning, there is a tendency in psychoanalysis to see the non-West or behaviors in the global South as relatively pathological or different, symptomatic, right? So that has been one of the problems, and I would sort of like to say that when so-called cultural versions of psychoanalysis emerged, whether what is now being called Indian psychoanalysis by some people, or I assume that might be true of other cultures also, other locations also. The attempt began with this idea that of depathologizing, but then in the process we got into our own conundrums. So I should just stay for a few minutes. Yeah, okay. But most importantly, I think Nivedita also points out, and especially in the context of India, that despite the many creative engagements that we have seen between psychoanalysis in our parts of the world, this attempt has been fraught with difficulties. And in the context of India especially, we can see that there is a very Hindu version of Indian psychoanalysis which has been produced. A lot of it is in the work of Sudhir Kakar, and though you do find some mentions and some references which could be considered to be outside this dominant Hindu frame, I would tend to agree that there is a predominantly Hindu understanding of India, and that to an upper caste Brahmanical understanding of the Indian self. And now this obviously renders a lot of people, a lot of selves as other. And there has also been contemporary writing, coming in the last decade or so, which has started to sort of reconfigure this question. We have managed to think of Hindu myths as replacing maybe Oedipus and Narcissus, but in the process we have Brahmanized psychoanalysis. This she's not done for India, she's done it with China, Japan, she has done this for Egypt, and she's discussed feminine the question of sexuality, and therefore there is a rich sort of engagement with questions which it is not really possible for one to go into in such a short period of time. If there are a few minutes, maybe I'll just say a few things, or shall I stop? Whatever you want.
Well, it's just that...
so I can actually stop also. The only one thing I wanted to say was that I thought about this after my second or third reading, and I think it's very interesting to ask questions about the person who comes to the clinic as a client or a patient, whichever word you prefer to use, and their selfhood in relationship. So what makes them what makes them choose what seems to be a secular, tradition? And I thought it's kind of interesting because Erickson, for example, has written somewhere that the patient who comes into the psychoanalytical clinic is actually an inverted dissenter. So also in Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, there is this whole question of why do we have to have the ego as an entity in the mechanisms of the psyche, and the idea really is to have a part of the self which is in a state of refusal to being completely civilized or completely acculturated, So in a sense, I think what makes psychoanalysis interesting is that it allows for people to be outsiders and then reflect upon themselves. So I wondered where that fits into, the entire sort of argument about, the deception of psychoanalysis. And of course there are other points I have, but I'm going to stop right now.